Her father never called it a trick. He called it thinking ahead of the cold. She was 9 years old the first time he took her underground on the family farm in Telemark. It was late October, the surface ground already beginning to stiffen under the first serious frosts of the season. The sky that morning had been the color of old pewter, low and unmoving, and the wind off the fjord carried the particular smell that meant the year was closing its hand. But below, 6 feet beneath the old smokehouse foundation, the air held at what her father said was just above 40 degrees. She did not know what that meant in any practical sense. Not yet, but she felt the warmth rising to meet her face as she climbed down the stone steps, a soft exhalation from the earth itself, and she remembered her father crouching beside a row of wax-sealed crocks, his breath barely visible in the lamplight where moments before above ground it had streamed from his mouth in white ribbons. "The earth remembers summer longer than we do," he said. His palm rested flat against the stone wall, fingers spread reading something she could not read yet. The lamp threw his shadow tall against the curved ceiling, and she watched his hand, the way a child watches the hands of a person who knows things. "It takes months to cool," he told her. "Once you understand that you stop fighting winter, you start borrowing what the ground already has."
The surface ground, already beginning to stiffen under the first serious frosts of the season. The sky that morning had been the color of old pewter, low and unmoving, and the wind, off the fjord, carried the particular smell that meant the year was closing its hand. But below, 6 feet, beneath the old smokehouse foundation, the air held at what her father said was just above 40 degrees. She did not know what that meant in any practical sense. Not yet, but she felt the warmth rising to meet her face as she climbed down the stone steps, a soft exhalation from the earth itself, and she remembered her father crouching beside a row of wax-sealed crocks, his breath barely visible in the lamplight where moments before. Above ground, light had streamed from his mouth in white ribbons. "The earth remembers summer longer than we do," he said. His palm rested flat against the stone wall, fingers spread, reading something she could not read yet. The lamp threw his shadow tall against the curved ceiling, and she watched his hand, the way a child watches the hands of a person who knows things. "It takes months to cool," he told her. "Once you understand that, you stop fighting winter. You start borrowing what the ground already has." She filed it away, a lesson without a test, a fact that sat in the back of her mind for years, collecting dust in a corner she rarely visited, the way childhood knowledge does when there is no immediate use for it. She did not know, kneeling there, beside her father in the lamplight, that the lesson was a seed, that it would lie dormant through an ocean crossing and a marriage and a death, and that it would not break open until she stood alone in a frozen river valley on the far side of the world, with the temperature outside her property at 38 degrees below zero, and everything she owned depending on whether she had understood what her father's hand had been trying to teach her. Before we go further, if you find yourself drawn into this story, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It helps these forgotten stories reach the people who still care about them. Her name was Sigrid Aalborg. She had come to Minnesota from Norway in the spring of 1924, following a cousin who had written letters full of cautious optimism about land prices and the length of the growing season. The letters had been careful, the way letters from people who have already committed to a hard choice tend to be careful. They spoke of black soil and clear water, and the way a man could own outright in America what he would rent for 3 generations at home. They did not speak much about the winters, or if they did, Sigrid had not properly understood what the word meant at that latitude. In that country, where the cold came down out of Canada, with nothing to slow it across 1,000 miles of open plain, she had crossed with her husband, Halvard. He had been a quiet man, broad through the shoulders, with hands that seemed to understand wood and stone and animal flesh by instinct, the way some men understand music. He laughed rarely, but when he did, it came from somewhere deep, and it changed his whole face. And Sigrid had married him in part for that laugh, and in part for the steadiness underneath it. I was the kind of man who looked at a problem and grew calm rather than agitated. The kind of man who, faced with a falling barn or a sick animal, or a child's fever, simply rolled up his sleeves and began. The 80 acres they purchased along a tributary of the Crow Wing River was honest land, timber on the north slope, hay ground in the low spots, a creek that ran clear most of the year and froze hard and silent in the winter months. They had built it up together across 5 years, the two of them and a horse, and the slow accumulation of small victories that a farm is made of. A fence finished, a field cleared, a roof made tight before the snow. They had not been rich, they had not expected to be, but they had been building something. And there is a particular kind of happiness in that, in the shared labor toward a thing not yet finished, that Sigrid did not fully recognize as happiness until it was taken from her. Halvard died in the summer of 1929, a ruptured appendix, 4 days of decline. No doctor who arrived in time. The nearest physician was 40 miles distant, and the message that went out by a neighbor's fast horse crossed paths somewhere on the road with the worsening of the thing it was meant to summon. By the time the man arrived, dust on his coat and his bag in his hand, and apology already gathering in his face. It was a matter of hours, and they both knew it. Howe was 34 years old. Sigrid was 31. She buried him on the north slope, under the timber, in the ground he had worked, on a morning in July, when the hay was high and green, and the whole valley hummed with the indifference of summer. The Lutheran minister came out from town and said the words. A handful of neighbors stood with their hats in their hands, and then they went home to their own farms and their own labor, because the season does not stop for grief. And the hay had to come in whether a man was alive to cut it or not. She had no family within 1,000 miles, no savings to spare after the years of establishing the property, and no practical reason to return to Norway, even if she had managed the money, because there was nothing waiting there either. Her father was gone. The farm in Telemark had passed to a brother she barely knew. The country of her childhood had become a country of the dead, and the country of her adulthood was 80 acres of Minnesota, with a fresh grave on the north slope. What she had was this: the 80 acres, a horse named Bjorn, aging now, gentle, who had pulled every stump and every plow and every wagon load across 5 years, and who looked at her each morning over the stall door with the patient expectation of an animal that does not know its master has died. A mixed breed dairy cow called Kavist, a woodshed stocked with roughly 2.5 cords of split birch, and a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the house that she had recognized almost immediately upon their arrival 5 years before as dangerously inadequate. It was 14 feet long and 8 feet wide. The walls were lined with stacked fieldstone, the roof made of rough-cut lumber under 2 feet of banked earth. In a mild winter, it held between 38 and 42 degrees, cold enough to keep root vegetables and jarred stores from spoiling, but only barely, a margin so thin that a single hard week could erase it. She knew this not as a theory, but as a wound, because in the winter of 1927, a 3-week cold snap had driven the temperature inside that cellar down to 22 degrees and frozen everything. She had not moved closer to the house. She had lost 100 pounds of potatoes, 3 crocks of pickled cabbage, most of her dried apple stores. She remembered carrying the ruined potatoes out by the bucketful, the flesh of them gone dark and sweet and soft with frost rot, and dumping them at the field edge for the crows, and the particular sick feeling of watching a season's careful work turn to waste because of 2 feet of inadequate earth and a cold that had simply outlasted her defenses. That winter, Halvard had been alive. They had absorbed the loss together, tightened their belts together, made it through to spring on what remained, and on the strength of 2 people pulling against the same load. Now there was one person, and the math of survival, which had been difficult before, became something starker. There was no second income, no second pair of hands, no one to take the morning chores when she was sick, or to carry the heavy thing she could not carry alone, or to say, across the supper table on a black February night, that they would be all right, that they had made it through worse. Every calorie she would eat through the coming winter, she would either grow, raise, or fail to have. Every loss would be hers alone to absorb, and the cellar that had failed once would, she understood, with a clarity that kept her awake, fail again. The first turn came on a gray afternoon in early September, less than 2 months after she had filled in the grave. She had gone to the old cellar to take inventory, to begin the long arithmetic of what she had and what she would need. The summer had been good. The garden had produced. There were potatoes to bring in soon, and turnips, and the cabbage was heading nicely. And she had been telling herself, in the way the recently bereaved tell themselves things, that the practical work would be manageable, that she could simply do what she and Halvard had always done. Only alone, she lifted the cellar door and went down the few earthen steps into the cool dimness. And she began to check the jars she had already put up. The early pickles, the first of the season's preserves. And there, in the lamplight, on the third jar, she lifted. She saw it, a hairline crack running up the side of the glass. She set it down and lifted the next, another, a third jar, with its seal lifted slightly, the contents beginning to cloud. The early September nights had already dropped low enough in that hollow of banked earth to stress the glass. A hard frost, 2 nights before, the first real one of the year, had reached down into the cellar and found the jars and begun, gently, almost politely, to break them. She stood very still, with the cracked jar in her 2 hands. It was September. The garden was still green. The leaves had not turned. By the calendar, winter was a rumor, a thing, months distant, and already the old cellar was failing. Already the cold was reaching in to take what she had stored. In the first week of September, with the whole long descent into January still ahead, if the cellar could not hold in September, it could not hold in January, and in January she would have no margin, no second person, no way to move everything closer to the house and run extra fires and absorb the loss. In January, the failure of that cellar would not be an inconvenience. It would be the difference between a winter she survived intact and a winter she survived by the skin of her teeth, hungry and frightened and dependent on the charity of neighbors who had their own difficulties to manage. She carried the cracked jars up into the daylight and set them on the ground and looked at them. And then she looked at the hillside cellar with its 2 feet of banked earth, and she understood, standing there in the gray September light, that the thing she had been telling herself was a lie, that she could not simply do what she and Halvard had done, that the old defenses had been inadequate even for 2, and that for 1, they were a trap. She would have to build something better, alone, before the ground froze, or she would not make it through. That was the first turn, the recognition that the familiar would not hold. And in the days that followed, as she began to think about what better might mean, a second difficulty arrived, of a kind she had not anticipated, wearing the face of a neighbor's kindness. The Quayle family farmed the land to the north. They were the nearest neighbors, a half-mile up the road, a solid Norwegian family, 3 children grown, and a 4th still at home, and the kind of standing in the small valley community that came from having arrived early and prospered steadily. Mrs. Quayle was a broad, capable, well-meaning woman who had brought a covered dish to the house in the days after Halvard's death, as was proper, and who had looked around Sigrid's kitchen with the assessing eye of a woman who has decided to take an interest. She came again in the 2nd week of September. She came on a fine afternoon, ostensibly to return a borrowed pan, and she sat at Sigrid's table and drank coffee and talked in widening circles, the way people do when they are working their way toward the real purpose of a visit. The weather, the harvest, the price of things, the hardness of the times, with the news from the banks growing worse by the week. And then, with the careful casualness of a woman laying down a card she has been holding the whole time, she mentioned a man, a widower, from the next county over. A good man, she said, steady, with a fine quarter section, and no children, and a need, as any man has, for a wife, to keep his house and share his labor. She let the words sit. She watched Sigrid's face over the rim of the coffee cup, and the meaning underneath the words was as plain as if she had spoken it outright, which was that a woman alone on 80 acres was an unnatural and unsustainable thing, a problem the community would prefer to see solved in the ordinary way, and that arrangements could be made, introductions managed, the whole untidy situation of a young widow tidied back into the expected shape of things. Sigrid set down her cup. She was quiet for a moment, not because she was considering it, but because she was choosing her words, and because she understood that what she said in the next breath would set the terms of how she lived in that valley for years to come. I am not looking to marry, she said. That was all. No anger in it, no drama, just the plain fact, laid down the way Her father had laid stones, flat and level and meant to last. Mrs. Quayle's face changed, not into open displeasure, into something more controlled and more permanent. A polite withdrawal, a reassessment, the face of a woman who has extended a hand on behalf of the proper order of things and had it declined, and who will not extend it again, and who will, in the thousand small ways available to a woman of standing in a small community. Let it be understood that the Aalborg widow had been offered help and had refused it, and was therefore on her own. She finished her coffee. She thanked Sigrid for it. She gathered her things and went, and the door closed behind her, and some subtle door closed with it that would not open again. From that afternoon forward, the Quayles were polite and distant. They nodded at the general store. They did not call, and the warmth that a young widow might have expected from the nearest neighbors in a hard country curdled quietly into the cool correctness reserved for a woman who has put herself outside the help she was offered. Sigrid washed the 2 coffee cups and set them to dry. She did not weep over it. She had wept enough that summer, and she was learning, in the brutal economy of her new life, to spend her grief carefully on the things that warranted it. The loss of the Quayle's goodwill was a cost. She entered it in the ledger, and she understood, drying her hands on her apron and looking out the window at the gray light failing over the hayfield, that the choice she had just made carried a price she would pay all winter, that she had refused the easy road, the road back into the protection of a husband and the approval of the community, and had chosen instead the road of a woman alone who would have to provide her own protection, build her own defenses, and prove to a valley that now half expected her to fail, that she could. She had always been more interested in results than in reputation, but she knew that evening that the two were about to be tested against each other in a way that would leave no room for doubt. The decision to dig came to her not as a sudden inspiration, but as a slow tightening of logic, the way a knot pulls taut. She needed storage that would not fail. The hillside cellar failed because it was shallow, because 2 feet of earth was not enough to hold back the deep cold of a Minnesota January. The answer, then, was depth, enough earth between the stored food and the killing air above that. The cold could not reach down to it before spring came to turn it back. She did not arrive at this through any book. She arrived at it through the wound of 1927 and through a memory that had begun, in the weeks since she found the cracked jars, to surface from the place where it had lain dormant for years. The lamplight, the stone steps, the warmth rising to meet her face, her father's palm flat against the wall. The earth remembers summer longer than we do. She had not thought of that root cellar in Telemark in a long time, but now it came back to her with the vividness of a thing the mind has been saving for the moment of its use. And she understood, lying awake on those September nights, that her father had not been speaking poetry. He had been describing a fact about how deep earth holds the warmth of the past season far into the next one, releasing it slowly, grudgingly, so that 6 feet down the ground in October is not the ground of October at all, but a memory of August, and that a structure built deep enough into that memory would be warmed by it, not heated, warmed, held above freezing by the stored summer of the earth itself. Through the coldest weeks the surface could throw at it. That was the whole of it. She understood now. You did not fight the winter at all. You reached down past it, into the slow warmth the ground had been holding since August, and you borrowed what was already there. She decided to dig, but where she would dig was its own question, and the answer to it brought the third turn of those early weeks, the moment when the inherited lesson stopped being a memory and became, suddenly, a thing she could feel under her own hand. She considered the obvious sites, near the house, where the carrying would be short, beside the old cellar, where she might extend what already existed, but she had reasons against each. Near the house, the ground had been disturbed and built over, the drainage uncertain. The old cellar site had already proven the hillside too exposed, and there was another consideration, one she did not fully admit to herself in the beginning, but that grew clearer as the autumn advanced, which was the matter of being seen. A woman alone, who had refused the community's help, digging a great pit beside her house, would be a spectacle, a subject for talk, and she found, after the visit from Mrs. Quayle, that she had developed a strong preference for keeping her business to herself, for building her defenses where they would not be obvious, for solving her problem quietly, in a place no casual eye would mark. She walked the property in the second week of September, turning the question over, and she came at last to the firewood shed at the northeast corner. It was a simple, open-faced structure, 18 feet wide and 12 feet deep, roofed with cedar shakes, open on the south side where the wood was loaded and pulled. Halvard had built it in their second year, and its back wall was tucked against a low ridge that broke the prevailing northwest wind, so that even in a gale, the air inside it was still. The ground beneath it had never been turned. For 5 years, it had carried the weight of stacked birch and the shelter of the roof above, undisturbed, packed, sheltered from the surface temperature swings that worked the open ground. She stood inside the shed in the dim light that came under the eaves, and on an impulse she did not examine. She knelt and pressed her palm flat against the bare earth of the floor, in the back half, beneath the lowest row of birch, and she felt it. She could not have put a number to it, but she felt, against her bare hand, that the ground, there was not the ground of the open field. It was drier, it was warmer, it held, even in the cool of a September afternoon, a faint residual heat, the heat of a place that had been roofed and sheltered and packed tight for 5 years, a place the frost had never properly reached, and the summer sun had never properly baked, a place that lived in a narrow, stable band of its own, insulated from the world above by the floor of the shed and the weight of the wood and the ridge at its back. She knelt there a long time with her hand against the earth, and the memory rose, complete, unbidden, her father's palm against the limestone wall in Telemark, fingers spread, reading something she could not read yet. She had watched him do that as a child and had not understood what he was reading. And now, 20-some years later, and an ocean away, kneeling in a firewood shed in Minnesota, with her own palm flat against the warm September earth, she understood. He had been reading the temperature of the ground. I had been feeling for exactly this, the held warmth of sheltered earth, the borrowed summer, the thing the ground already had, and she was feeling it now, under her own hand, in the one corner of her own property where 5 years of an open-faced shed had created, without anyone intending it, the precise conditions her father had taught her to recognize. This was the place, not the obvious place, not the convenient place, but the right place, confirmed, not by any instrument or calculation, but by the same sense her father had carried in his palm and passed to her, without either of them knowing it had taken the ridge behind it, breaking the wind, the packed, undisturbed subsoil, sheltered for 5 years from the surface swings, the floor above, holding off the frost, and the last consideration, the one that made her decision final, which was that the firewood shed was the last place on earth anyone would think to look for a woman's winter stores. To any eye, it was a woodshed. It would remain a woodshed, and what she built beneath it would be hers alone, unseen, unsuspected, doing its quiet work in the dark. While the valley above went white, she stood up and brushed the soil from her knee. She marked out a rectangle in her mind, 9 feet by 14, in the back half of the shed, beneath the rows of stacked birch. She thought about the spade and the mattock and the wheelbarrow. She thought about the fieldstone she would need, and where she would get it, and how she would haul it. She thought about depth, about how deep was deep enough, and she settled, standing there in the failing light, on 9 feet, 9 feet of earth, between the stored food and the killing air. Enough, she judged, to hold the borrowed summer through the worst the valley could send. It was the first week of September. The surface ground was still workable, but the air already carried the particular bite of coming cold, the bite that told her the window would not stay open long, that the easy digging of early autumn would harden into the impossible digging of October frost within weeks, and that whatever she meant to build, she had better build now. She went to the barn and found the long-handled spade where Halvard had hung it, and she carried it back to the shed in the last of the daylight, and she stood it against the back wall where she would find it in the morning. She did not begin that evening. There was supper to make and the animals to settle, and the light was nearly gone. But she stood for a moment in the doorway of the shed, looking at the marked ground and the waiting spade, and she felt something move in her that was not quite hope and not quite grief, but something steadier than either, the feeling of a person who has stopped waiting for help that is not coming and has decided, instead, to begin. Tomorrow, she would put the spade into the earth. She thought of Halvard, in the ground on the north slope, who had built this shed with his own hands and could not know what she was about to build beneath it. She thought of her father, in the ground in Telemark, whose lesson had waited all those years in the back of her mind for exactly this. The earth remembers summer longer than we do. She had not understood him at 9. She understood him now, and she would spend the coming days proving, with a spade and a mattock, and her own 2 hands, that she had understood him well enough to live. The light failed over the hayfield. The first stars came out, hard and bright, in the clear cold air, the way they only come out when the year is turning toward winter. Somewhere out in the timber, an owl called once and went silent. Sigrid Alborg latched the shed door and walked back across the dark yard to the house where she now lived alone, and began to make her supper and to ready herself for the work that would either carry her through the winter or break her trying. She did not yet know how cold it would get. She did not know that the winter coming was not an ordinary winter, that the temperature outside her property would drop to 38 degrees below zero and hold there for 9 consecutive days, that the birch in this north woodlot would split with the sound of rifle shots, and the breath would freeze and fall from her mouth like a scattering of glass. She did not know that the thing she was about to build in secret beneath a woodshed would be tested that winter against the kind of cold that killed livestock in their barns and froze the stores of families who had farmed that valley for 30 years. She knew only that she had a memory and a spade and a window of soft September ground that was closing a little more with every cold night. It would have to be enough. And in the gray light of the following morning, with her breath streaming white and the frost silver on the hayfield, she walked out to the firewood shed, and she lifted the spade, and she put the first foot of black Minnesota topsoil up and out onto the waiting ground, and she began to borrow what the earth already had. The first foot came up easy, black topsoil, light and loose, smelling of roots and rain, the soil of 5 summers' fallen birch leaves, broken down into something rich and dark. She lifted it in clean spadefuls and turned it onto a square of canvas she had laid beside the pit, because she had already decided that the spoil would not be scattered carelessly but managed, sorted. The topsoil kept separate from what lay beneath, because she would want it later for the disguising of the roof. The second foot was heavier, dense clay, laced subsoil that came up in dark clods and smelled of iron, the way deep earth always does when it has not seen light in decades. She felt the change in her shoulders before she saw it in the spade, the way the ground stopped yielding and began to resist, the way each cut had to be worked rather than lifted. By the time she had the second foot stripped across the whole 9 by 14 rectangle, the sun was high and her shirt was wet through, and her hands had begun the slow education that would, over the coming days, harden into calluses she would carry for years. By the third foot, she had switched to a mattock. The hard pan began there, the compacted layer where the subsoil had been pressed by its own weight and by the centuries into something close to stone, and the spade was useless against it. She broke it in short, measured swings, the mattock rising and falling in a rhythm she found and kept, loading the broken earth into the wheelbarrow and walking it 30 yards out to a low spot at the edge of the hayfield, where she dumped it and spread it and walked back. She did not swing hard. She had learned in 5 years of farm labor that the hard swing was the swing that hurt you, that the work of a long day was done at a pace that could be held, and she held it. 3 hours in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, every day, through 11 days of pale September light. She worked alone. There is a particular quality to solitary labor that those who have done it know, and those who have not cannot quite imagine. The mind empties and fills and empties again. The body becomes a machine for the moving of earth, and somewhere above the machine, the thoughts drift free. And Sigrid found, in those 11 days, at the bottom of a deepening pit, that she thought of Halvard less as a wound and more as a presence, as if he were there, just at the edge of the shed, watching her work with that steady calm of his, neither helping nor judging, simply there. She talked to him sometimes, not aloud, but in the place where a person talks to the dead. She told him what she was doing and why, and she felt, in the telling, that he understood, that he would have done the same, that he might even have been proud of the particular stubbornness that had set her digging instead of marrying. The pit went down 4 feet, 5. At 6 feet, she had to cut steps into one wall so she could climb in and out, and she cut them carefully, 8 of them, each one tamped firm, because she understood she would be using them all winter, and a careless step in the dark of January was a broken ankle, and a broken ankle alone on a farm in winter was a death sentence. At 7 feet, the walls rose above her head, and the light came down to her in a shaft, and the air at the bottom grew cool and still, and held that faint, earthen warmth she had felt with her palm. Stronger now, undeniable, the borrowed summer of the deep ground. At 9 feet she stopped. She stood at the bottom of a pit, 9 feet deep, and 9 feet by 14 across, and she looked up at the rectangle of pale sky framed by the shed roof, and she felt the cool, stable air around her, and she knew, the way her father had known things, that she had dug deep enough. Below her was earth that the frost would never reach. Around her was earth that held the summer she had cut down into the memory of August, and now she would build inside it. The walls came next. She lined them with flat fieldstone she had been collecting from the creek bank since July, before Halvard's grave was even properly settled, before she had fully articulated to herself what the stone was for, gathering it on instinct, the way her father had taught her to gather useful things against future need. 160 pounds of it, hauled in the wagon, over 3 trips down the rough track to the creek and back, stacked near the shed through the summer months. Waiting, she set the stones dry, without mortar, fitting them tight against the earth walls, and tamping coarse sand into the gaps. It was slow, exacting work, the work of matching each stone to its place, of turning a stone in her hands to find the face that fit, of building up a wall that would stand without binding. And as she worked, she thought about why she was doing it this way, and the answer was the principle her father had pressed into her memory with his palm against the telemark wall. Stone absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. A stone wall, underground, does not cool at the same rate the air above it does. It resists, it holds. A wall of fieldstone set against the deep earth would take the borrowed warmth of the ground and store it and give it back, slowly, through the long nights, long after the surface had gone white. Earth surrounding stone, stone absorbing earth's warmth, the two of them together, working as one mass, holding the line against the cold. She did not have the words for thermal mass. She did not need them. She had her father's palm and her father's voice, and the certainty in her own hands. And that was a deeper kind of knowing than any word. The floor she treated with equal care, packed earth, leveled flat, covered first with 3 inches of coarse washed sand, tamped smooth. And then, over the sand, she did a thing that her father had done in Telemark, a thing she had watched him do without understanding and now understood completely. She laid a second course of stones, smaller flat pieces, but she did not lay them cold. She built a sustained bonfire at the field edge, fed it through an afternoon until it was a bed of deep coals, and she heated the stones in it, one batch after another, until they were too hot to touch. Then she carried each one to the pit, wrapped in burlap, while still warm, and she set it into the floor, hot, so that its heat went down into the sand and the packed earth beneath. A floor laid with stones that had been fire-heated before burial would not surrender its warmth in a single night, not even in a series of nights. The thermal mass of 200 pounds of fieldstone, sitting at the bottom of a pit 9 feet below the surface, charged with the heat of a bonfire, would hold a detectable trace of that warmth for weeks. It was a small thing, a few degrees, perhaps, but a few degrees. In the deep cold of January was the whole difference between food that kept and food that froze. And Sigrid had learned the value of a few degrees the hard way, carrying ruined potatoes out by the bucketful in the winter of 1927. The roof was the part that required the most thought. She used 6-inch rough sawn pine planks, laid across the 9-foot span in 2 sections, supported at the center by a beam. She mortised into notches. She cut into the stone of the walls. It was heavy work, the setting of that beam, the kind of work meant for 2 strong men, and she did it alone, with a lever and a ramp and patience. And more than one moment, when the weight nearly got away from her and she stood braced against it, her whole body shaking, until she could ease it down into its seat. When it was set, she rested her hand on it and felt it hold, and she thought, that is Halvard's work as much as mine, because he had taught her the mortise and the lever and the patience, and she was using all of it now. Over the planks, she packed 4 inches of the driest hay from last summer's cutting, compressed by hand, layered like thatch, dense enough to hold its shape, but airy enough to trap the dead air pockets that make hay one of the most effective natural insulators in any farming household. Over the hay, she stretched a sheet of waxed canvas, salvaged from a grain cover, overlapping the edges, a full foot on each side, and tucking them down against the wall stones so that no water could find its way through to the hay and the food below. And over the canvas, she shoveled 12 inches of subsoil, the very subsoil she had dug out of the pit, pressing it into a low arch with her hands and feet, smoothing the surface until it looked like undisturbed ground. Then she brought back the topsoil she had set aside on the first day, the black leaf-rich soil, and she spread it over the subsoil so that the color matched the floor of the shed exactly, and she stacked the birch back over it. Every split piece returned to where it had been, the rows neat and ordinary, and she set the hatch into the third row from the right, a 2-foot square of pine planks, fitted flush, that lifted on a leather pull strap, invisible, unless you moved the wood and knew what you were looking for. To anyone loading or pulling firewood from that shed, nothing had changed. The floor looked solid. The wood sat in its ordinary rows. The structure was the same building it had always been, in the same corner of the same property, doing the same thing it had always done. That, too, was part of the design. The secret was not only in the depth and the stone and the hay. The secret was in the ordinariness, in the perfect plainness of a woodshed that was only a woodshed to every eye that passed it. In the last days of September, she stocked it. She lowered into the pit by lamplight, working carefully down the 8 steps with each load. 140 pounds of potatoes in burlap sacks, 60 pounds of turnips, 4 crocks of salted pork, sealed with rendered fat, 11-quart jars of pickled beets and cabbage, 2 crocks of lard, a 50-pound sack of cornmeal inside a cedar box she had fitted with a tight sealed lid to keep the moisture out, and last, wrapped twice in oilcloth and tucked into a corner, a tin containing $40 in paper money, everything she would need to survive a hard winter without leaving the property or spending $1 she did not have. She stood at the bottom of the finished pit in the lamplight, surrounded by her stores, and she felt the cool, stable air on her face. And it was the air of the Telemark cellar, the air of her childhood, the borrowed summer held in the deep ground. She had built it, alone, with a memory and a spade and her own 2 hands. And whatever the winter brought, she had given herself a fighting chance. The neighbors noticed, the way neighbors always do. The quails to the north were polite and distant, and had been, since the afternoon Sigrid declined Mrs. Quayle's introduction, and they observed the activity at the Aalborg place with the cool incuriosity of people who have decided a thing is not their concern. The Vang brothers to the south were younger men, unmarried, who farmed together and observed most of what Sigrid did with the distracted shrug of people managing their own sufficient difficulties. It was Torvald Engebretsen who said aloud what others had probably said privately. How was a 3rd-generation Norwegian farmer, 3 miles east, an older man, weathered, with a long memory and the habit of attention that comes to men who have spent their lives reading land and weather. He had stopped his wagon at her lane one afternoon in the last week of the digging, the way he sometimes did, to pass the time, the way men do when they have been alone with their thoughts all week and want the sound of another voice. He could see the mound of displaced subsoil at the edge of the hayfield, weathered now, settling. He could see the last of the creek stones stacked near the shed. He looked at it the way you look at something that does not fit the pattern you expect. Building something, he asked. Improving the storage, she said, under the woodshed. Not quite a question. Yes, she said. A pause. He turned his hat in his hands, which was the way he bought himself time when he was deciding whether to say a thing or leave it. And here was the 4th turn, the moment that would sit in the back of her mind through the autumn, because she watched his weathered face and saw something move behind his eyes, some recognition, some thought. He had clearly half decided to speak. His mouth opened slightly. He looked at the shed, and then at the mound of subsoil, and then back at the shed. And Sigrid had the distinct sense that this old man, alone of all the valley, knew exactly what she was building, had perhaps seen such a thing before, in the old country, or in his own family's past, and was on the very edge of saying so. But he left it, whatever it was. He closed his mouth, and he clicked his horse forward, and he drove on down the road. And Sigrid stood at her lane and watched the wagon grow small and wondered what he had been about to say, whether it had been a warning, whether it had been knowledge, whether the old man had recognized in her secret pit the shape of something his own father had built, and had decided, for reasons of his own, that it was not his place to speak of it. She did not know, and the not knowing stayed with her, a small unanswered question, through the weeks that followed. 3 weeks later, through the ordinary channels of rural gossip, the general store mostly, sometimes the feed mill, Sigrid heard that the phrase "that Aalborg woman" and her whole had made at least one public appearance. She found she did not mind particularly. The talk cost her nothing she valued. A name was a cheap thing to lose. A winter's food was not. Let them call it a hole. The hole would keep her fed through the dark months, and the talk would keep her warm not at all. And between the two, she knew which she had chosen and why. She finished her preparations, and she let the valley say what it would, and she turned her attention to the work that remained before the snow. October hardened. November came in gray and serious, the birch dropping their leaves in a rush, the fields going from amber to gray to white in less than 2 weeks. The Crow-Wing tributary froze over in the second week of November, which was early even by local standards, the ice creeping out from the banks and meeting in the middle, and thickening day by day into a gray road that ran the length of the valley. Sigrid spent the darkening afternoons of late autumn doing the work that determined whether you survived winter comfortably or endured it by the skin of your teeth, rechinking the north wall of the house, where she could feel the cold air seeping through, oiling every piece of leather tack in the barn so it would not stiffen and crack, splitting the last of her summer-cut wood, and building the pile under the shed to a full 4 cords, stacked over and around the hidden hatch, so that the secret beneath was buried under the very fuel that would warm her house all winter. She settled the animals into their winter routine, Bjorn the horse, aging and gentle, and Kavis the cow, who had eaten well through the fall and was carrying good winter condition, the layer of fat and the thick coat that an animal grows when it is fed properly and allowed to prepare for the cold. The barn was board and batten construction from their first year on the property, insulated only by its own walls and whatever warmth the animals generated among themselves. For ordinary Minnesota winters, it was sufficient. Sigrid checked it, chinked what gaps she could reach, and judged it would hold, as it had held every winter before. The first test came in early December, not the worst. That was still weeks away, but cold enough to tell her something. On the morning of December the 8th, the thermometer, nailed to the north porch post, read 14 below zero. The world outside was locked and white and silent, the kind of cold that made the snow squeak underfoot and the nostrils stick together with each breath. She did her morning chores with her face wrapped in wool. And then, at midday, when the brief sun had done what little it could, she walked to the woodshed, and she moved aside the birch from the third row, and she lifted the hatch. The air that rose from below was cool and faintly moist, but not cold, not biting. She climbed down the 8 steps she had cut into the earth wall and stood in the pit, holding her bare hand at chest height and waiting, the way her father had taught her, letting the skin find the temperature. 40 degrees, she estimated, maybe 41. Outside, 14 below. Inside the ground, beneath a woodshed, shielded by 9 feet of earth and stone, and packed hay and waxed canvas. Winter was a rumor. She stood there a moment in the lamplight. It fell on the crocks, the jars, the cedar box. The potato sacks were dry. The lard was firm but scoopable. Nothing had shifted. Nothing had frozen. She thought of Telemark, limestone walls, lamplight, the warmth rising to meet her face at 9 years old. The palm against the wall. She had built it true. The first hard cold of the season had come, and the pit had held, and the borrowed summer was doing exactly what her father had said it would do. She climbed back up, replaced the hatch, stacked the birch back into its rows, and walked to the house to make supper, and allowed herself, that evening, a small warmth that was not from any fire. But here was the 5th turn, and it came not as a triumph, but as a warning. Riding the airwaves into her quiet kitchen, she ran the radio carefully. A battery unit, 30 minutes in the morning and 30 in the evening, because the batteries were dear and not easily replaced. And on the evening of the 8th, flush with the small victory of the pit, she turned it on to hear the weather, and the voice that came through the static was not the ordinary voice of an ordinary forecast. A high-pressure ridge, the voice said, had begun to build over the northern plains. Arctic air was massing in the far north, over Canada, a dense continuous body of it, and the pattern showed every sign of locking in place. The forecaster, in the careful language of a man who does not want to alarm, but cannot in conscience reassure, said that the region should prepare for an extended period of severe cold. He did not give numbers. He did not say how cold or how long. He said only that it was coming, that it was large, and that it showed no sign of moving. Sigrid sat very still in the lamplight and listened. She had felt the pit hold at 14 below. She had been glad of it. But 14 below, she understood now, had been the small cold, the ordinary cold, the cold. The old cellar might even have survived. What the radio was describing was something else, something larger, the kind of cold that came once in a generation and was remembered by name, that froze the deep ice and split the standing timber and tested every defense a person had built down to its foundations. And it was coming for her valley, for her 80 acres, for her secret pit, and her board, and batten barn, and her 4 cords of wood, and her own single pair of hands. And there was nothing she could do now but wait for it and trust what she had built. She turned off the radio to save the batteries. She sat in the quiet kitchen with the lamp burning low, and outside the window, the stars were hard and bright and merciless in the black, cold air. And she thought about the days that lay somewhere ahead of her, unknown in their number. Then, the days she would come to remember for the rest of her life. The cold deepened through the middle of the month, easing and returning. Each return a little harder than the last. The high-pressure ridge settling over the northern plains like a great hand pressing down. And then, in the 3rd week of January, it arrived in full. On the morning of January the 14th, the porch thermometer read 29 below. By evening, it was 33. The radio, in its careful voice, reported that the ridge had locked and would not move, that the Arctic air was flowing down out of Canada in a dense, unbroken mass, with nothing between it and the northern valleys but 1,000 miles of frozen ground. The forecast was not specific. It was simply colder. By January the 17th, the morning reading was 38 below zero. At that temperature, the world changes its nature. The moisture in your exhaled breath does not drift. It crystallizes and falls, a faint shimmer of ice in the air in front of your face. A thing Sigrid had heard described by old-timers and had never seen until she stood on her own porch that morning and breathed out and watched her breath turn to glass and scatter. Exposed skin lost sensation in under 5 minutes. The birch trees in the north woodlot made sounds at night like rifle cracks, sharp and sudden and startling in the absolute silence, as their trunks split along the grain, the sap freezing and expanding inside the wood faster than the fiber could hold. The creek, frozen solid for 2 months, groaned and boomed under the pressure of the new cold driving down into its ice. Sigrid stood at her window on the morning of the 17th and looked out at a world that had become something other than the world she knew. The smoke from her chimney rose straight up into the windless air, a white column against a sky so cold it had gone nearly white itself. The snow on the fields had a hard blue cast. Nothing moved, no bird, no animal, no neighbor's smoke that she could see. The whole valley had drawn in on itself and gone silent and still in the grip of a cold that did not lift with the sun, that reset each night to something lower and held there through the days without the usual midday softening, a cold that had settled in to stay. She had built her defenses. She had dug her pit and stocked it and tested it. She had 4 cords of wood and a barn that had held every winter before, and a memory of her father's palm against a stone wall, an ocean, and a lifetime away. Now the cold had come to test all of it, and she did not yet know, standing at that frozen window on the morning of the 17th, that it would hold there at 38 below for 9 consecutive days, that the real trial of everything she had built and everything she was had only just begun. 9 days. She would not know the number until it was over. In the living of it, there was only the next morning, and the next, each one colder than seemed possible, each one demanding to be survived before the one after it could be imagined. This is the thing about a great cold that the people who have not lived through one cannot understand. It is not an event. It is a siege. It does not strike and pass. It settles in and stays and presses, day after day after day. And the survival of it is not a single act of courage, but a long accumulation of small disciplines, performed correctly every day, with no margin for the day you perform them wrong. Sigrid Aalborg ran her house on 3 fires: the kitchen range, the parlor stove, and the small box stove in the bedroom that she kept barely breathing overnight. Banked low, just enough to prevent the water bucket from turning solid and the window glass from cracking in its frame. She moved between the 3 of them through the short days and the long nights, feeding them, banking them, reading them, the way her father had read the stone wall, by feel and by long familiarity, knowing without looking which one wanted wood and which one would hold another hour. And she was burning through it faster than she had planned for. This was the first of the small crises, and it announced itself, not with any drama, but with simple arithmetic, the kind of arithmetic that kills people in the far country if they cannot do it in their heads on a cold morning. Cold that severe draws the heat out of a house through the walls, the way a drain draws water, constantly, without pause, and the 4 cords she had judged sufficient for an ordinary winter were vanishing into the 3 stoves at a rate that, continued, would leave her short before the worst of February. She did the figures on the 3rd morning of the cold snap, standing in the woodshed with her breath crystallizing, counting the rows, and she saw the problem plainly. So she rationed 2 loads to the parlor stove per day, not 3, the range only, during cooking and the hour after. The bedroom stove banked so low it was barely a living thing, and she slept in wool and under every blanket she owned, and woke in a room cold enough to see her breath. And she counted it a fair price for the wood it saved. She moved through her own house in coat and scarf. She did the work that had to be done quickly and returned to the one warm room, and she made the 4 cords stretch by discipline, by the daily refusal of the easy comfort, the way she had made everything stretch since the summer. Halvard died. The cold did not care about her economies. The hinges on the barn door froze open on the morning of the 18th, locked solid in the position they had last been left, and it took her 20 minutes of patient work with a candle flame, holding the small fire close to the iron, warming it degree by degree until the ice in the joint released and the door would move. Her fingers went numb in the doing of it. She warmed them inside her coat, against her own body, and went back to the candle and the hinge, and she got the door closed at last. And she thought, standing there in this brutal cold, with the spent candle in her hand, that this was how it went in a cold like this. Every ordinary thing became a labor. Every simple task became a negotiation with a world that had turned, for a little while, actively hostile to the small warm fact of a living person. Each morning, she checked the pit. It became the still point of her days, the one place she went, not in anxiety, but in something close to faith. On the 3rd day of the cold snap, she climbed down the hatch steps in the pre-dawn dark, a lamp in one hand, her breath crystallizing even in the descent, until she dropped below the frost line and the air changed, and she held her bare palm up at chest height and waited. 41 degrees. Outside, 38 below. Beneath the firewood shed, beneath 9 feet of earth and stone and fire, heated floor and packed hay and waxed canvas. The temperature had moved less than a single degree from the reading she had taken in December. Before the great cold came, the stone floor was cool but not cold. The earth walls were dry. The potatoes were firm. The lard solid. The jars uncracked. The system was doing precisely what it had been built to do, holding the line between the world above and the stored warmth below, giving back September's heat in January's darkness. Degree by degree, without asking anything in return, she knelt and put her hand flat against the stone floor, and she felt, faint but real, the trace of warmth still living in the fire-heated stones, the bonfire of September, still whispering up through the sand 4 months later. Exactly as she had intended, exactly as the principal promised, she stayed down there longer than she needed to on those mornings, not from worry, from a kind of communion. The pit was warm and still, and held the smell of earth and stored food and the lamplight. And it was, she came to understand, the closest thing she had on the whole frozen property to the feeling of not being alone. It was her father's cellar. It was Telemark. It was the one place where the lesson and the labor and the memory all came together and held, and held, and held. She allowed herself, on those mornings, a feeling that was not quite pride and not quite relief. It sat somewhere between those 2 things, closer to recognition, the precise sensation of a thing being exactly what you built it to be. She climbed back up into the killing cold each morning, carrying that feeling like a small coal in her chest, and it warmed her, in its way, more than the rationed fires did. The 9th day was when the second great crisis arrived. She had been tending Kavist 3 times daily through the worst of the weather, carrying extra hay each morning, a bucket of warmed water from the kitchen range, careful attention to the animal's breathing and posture. The barn had held through the first 8 days in the way it had always held, the body heat of the 2 animals and the shelter of the board and batten walls, keeping the interior in a band that was uncomfortable but survivable. But 8 days of 38 below is not the same as 4 days of 38 below. The cold is cumulative. It works inward, hour by hour, day by day, finding every gap, stripping every reserve. And what a barn can hold for 4 days, it cannot necessarily hold for 9. On the morning of the 9th day, Sigrid opened the barn door and felt the difference immediately. Not the temperature itself, that takes a moment to register, but the particular quality of the air in a building that has gone too cold, dense, still, the kind of stillness that is not restful, but ominous, the stillness of a space from which the last reserve of warmth has finally been drawn. The thermometer she kept nailed to the center post read 9 degrees above zero. The barn, which had held at 15 and 16 through the early days, had finally been beaten down by the sheer relentless accumulation of the cold to 9 above. And 9 above, for an animal already 8 days into the siege, was dangerous. Kavist stood at the far wall with her head lowered. The cow was breathing in shallow pulls, her weight shifted forward toward her front legs, the posture of an animal pulling its resources inward toward its core, abandoning the periphery to the cold. The water in the trough had frozen despite the floating block of wood Sigrid kept in it to slow the process, and when Sigrid crossed the barn and pressed her bare palm against the animal's flank, the warmth she felt there was thinner than it should have been, the warmth of a body doing the hard work of maintaining its core temperature and losing ground, slowly, to a cold that would not stop and would not break. Sigrid stood in the barn doorway and understood the situation with perfect clarity. She could not warm the barn. She had nothing to warm it with beyond the range in the house, and she could not safely run a fire in a board and batten structure full of hay, not without risking a barn fire that would kill the animals faster than the cold and burn her out of house and home. Besides, the forecast showed no break until the following day at the earliest. The animal had eaten well through the fall and was carrying good winter condition. But she was not built for this, not for 9 days of this, and another night at 9 above might take her. Sigrid looked at the woodshed 30 feet away, and she did the calculation that people do in emergencies. The calculation that is not for the ideal solution, but for the sufficient one. The solution you can actually build with what is actually in your hands in the next hour. She looked at the shared corner where the east wall of the barn and the west wall of the shed came within 4 feet of each other. AJP she and Halvard had once talked about closing with a connecting passage, the way some of the older farms in the valley had done, and had never gotten to. She looked at the gap, and at the barn, and at the thermometer reading 9 above, and she saw what she could do. She would not warm the barn. She would slow the cold. She gathered what she had immediately at hand, 2 full hay bales from the loft, which she unwired and opened into loose mass, a second piece of waxed canvas, the same material she had used on the pit roof, a remnant section 12 feet long, 4 lengths of rough-sawn 2x6 she had stacked in the shed rafters for future use, a spool of baling wire, a hammer, and a box of 8-penny nails. She built a partition across the 4-foot gap between the 2 structures. Not a wall, exactly, a wane barrier and an insulating layer. She compressed the hay bales and stacked them to fill the width of the gap, packing them tight, building a dense mass of trapped air. She stretched the canvas over and around the hay and nailed it into the wooden walls on both sides, sealing the face of it against the weather, and she braced the 2x6s diagonally to hold the whole assembly against the wind that came around the north end of the ridge in sustained flat gusts. The wind that had been driving through that 4-foot gap all week, like air through a funnel, stripping the residual warmth out of the barn faster than the animals could replace it. It took her an hour and 20 minutes. Her fingers went numb twice. Both times she stopped, and she went into the barn, and she pressed them against Kvist's neck and held them there until the joints came back, standing, with her cheek resting against the animal's warm side, feeling the slow, deliberate breathing, taking warmth from his creature she was working to save and giving back. She hoped the only thing she had to give, which was the labor of her two numb hands. And then she went back out into the cold and the wind and the partition, and she finished it. What she was doing was not complicated, and it was not elegant. The mathematics of insulation are straightforward. Every gap sealed is a loss prevented. Every layer added between an animal and a 38 below wind is degrees recovered at no fuel cost. She was not adding heat. She had no heat to add. She was subtracting the loss. She was closing the funnel through which the cold had been pouring, and trusting that the body heat of the animal, no longer stripped away as fast as it was made, would begin to rebuild a survivable warmth in the still air of the sealed barn. By mid-afternoon, working with no instrument more precise than her own hand, held at shoulder height, she estimated the barn had risen to 13 above. Kavist was standing squarely on all four legs. The breathing had deepened and steadied. The posture had eased. The animal no longer hunched forward over its own failing warmth, but standing level, settled. The immediate crisis passing, Sigrid brought 2 buckets of hot water from the range, walking quickly across the frozen yard, with her arms wrapped around them to hold the heat, and the cow drank both in long, deliberate pulls, the way an animal drinks when its body has been calling for water, and finally trusts that it can spare the warmth to take it. By evening, the barn was 14 above and holding. Kavist moved to the hay rack on her own, which was the last signal Sigrid needed. An animal that walks to its feed is an animal that has decided to live. She stood in the barn a moment longer in the lamplight, her hand on the cow's warm flank, and then she banked the situation in her mind as managed, as survived, and she went into the house and slept. For the first time in 9 days, the sleep of someone who has met the thing that came for her and held the line. The cold broke on the 10th day. The morning thermometer read 15 below instead of 38, and 15 below, after 9 days of 38, felt almost like a reprieve, almost like warmth. And it was on that 10th day, in the late morning, with the worst finally past, and the smoke beginning to rise again from the chimneys up and down the valley, that the third turn of the final act arrived. On foot, up her frozen lane, in the form of a broken man. His name was Gunnar Sledadal. He farmed 8 miles east, and Sigrid knew him only by sight and reputation. A hard-working man, by all accounts, who had come through the years before the cold snap with a thin margin and a run of bad luck. She had heard, in the way one hears things, that the cold had hit him hard, that he had lost livestock, that the talk at the store was that Sledadal had lost more than he was willing to say. And now here he was, coming up her lane on the 10th morning, on foot, his coat inadequate, his face gray and hollow, with cold, and with something worse than cold. And Sigrid set down her work and went out onto the porch to meet him. Because that is what you do in the far country. When a man comes up your lane on foot in the dead of winter, he stopped a little distance off. I did not come close, and she understood, looking at him, that the distance was not caution, but shame. He had heard, he said, his voice rough, the words coming hard. He had heard that the Aalborg place had come through all right, that her stores had held. I did not know if it was true. I had not believed it, frankly. A woman alone, the talk about the hole under the shed. He had not believed any of it, but his own cellar had frozen on the 8th day of the cold. He had lost near everything. His vegetables, his preserves, the food that was to carry his household to spring. And he had children, and he had come, against every instinct of pride a farming man possesses, to ask, not for charity. He said the word with difficulty, not for charity, but to ask whether she had anything she could sell him, anything at all, at whatever price, so that he could feed his family until the thaw. And here was the moment. Sigrid Aalborg stood on her porch in the cold and looked at this man who had likely repeated the phrase about her hole. This man who had not believed a woman alone could do what she had done. This man who had come now in his desperation to the very door he had probably mocked, and she felt no temptation to make him say more than he had said. She felt no impulse to lecture him, to point out that she had built her defense while his had failed, to extract from his shame any payment of vindication. What mattered, standing on that porch, was not the old talk or the settling of any score. What mattered was a man with hungry children and a frozen cellar, and what she had in the ground beneath her woodshed. She told him to come in out of the cold first. He would not. At first, the shame held him at the edge of the yard, but she went down off the porch and crossed to him and took his arm, the way you take the arm of a person who has stopped being able to make sensible decisions, and she brought him into the warm kitchen and sat him by the range and gave him coffee, and she let him get the cold out of his bones before she spoke another word about food. And then she went out to the woodshed. She did not bring him with her. She left him in the kitchen with his coffee because the location of the hatch was hers, and some habits of privacy do not break even in a moment of mercy. She moved the birch and lifted the hatch and climbed down into the warm pit, and she filled 2 burlap sacks, potatoes, turnips, a crock of the salted pork, some of the jarred beets and cabbage. Not everything. She had her own winter to finish, and she was nobody's fool, but enough. Enough to carry a household with children to the thaw. She climbed back up and stacked the birch and carried the sacks across the frozen yard to the kitchen, and she set them down in front of Gunnar Sledadal. He looked at the sacks and then at her, and he tried to speak about payment, about the $40 he did not have, and the work he would do in spring to settle it. And Sigrid let him say his piece, because a man needs to keep what dignity he can. And then she did the thing that was the true measure of her. She did not only give him the food, she told him how it was done. She sat across from him at the table, and she described the pit, the depth, the 9 feet of earth, the stone walls set dry against the ground, the fire-heated floor, the hay and the canvas, and the foot of subsoil over the top. The earth remembers summer longer than we do, she told him, the way her father had once told her. The ground holds its warmth far into the cold, if you dig deep enough to reach it. She gave him not only the meal, but the means, not only the fish, but the manner of the fishing, so that the man who had come up her lane in shame would go back down it with the knowledge to build his own defense and never again watch his family's winter freeze in an inadequate cellar. It was the most generous thing she could have done, and she did it plainly, without flourish, the way you hand a tool to a man who needs it. Gunnar Sledadal went home that afternoon with 2 sacks of food on a borrowed sledge and a head full of dimensions and principles. And whatever he had said about her before, he did not say again, and the matter was never spoken of between them in any way but the way of 2 farmers who have an understanding. He paid her back in the spring, in labor, as he had said he would, and he built his own pit that summer under the dimensions she had given him, and it held, and his family did not go hungry again. When the roads allowed proper travel, Torvald Engebretsen drove over. The old man came up the lane on a clear, cold day in early February, when the great cold had given way to the ordinary cold that the old-timers called the second winter, which was simply winter continuing without the particular fury of the first. He had heard the news of the valley by then, that the quail's root cellar had frozen on the 12th day of the cold, and they had lost 2/3 of their stored vegetables, that Sledadal had lost livestock, more than he would say, that several families had come through intact, but had burned through nearly all their wood, and were scrambling to resupply before March. And he had heard, too, the other thing, that the Aalborg widow had come through whole, that her stores had held, that the hole under the woodshed, the thing the valley had laughed about, had done in the worst cold in a generation what the proper sellers of 30-year farms had failed to do. He stood in her yard and looked at the woodshed for a long moment without saying anything. The same ordinary, unchanged exterior. The birch stacked the same as always. The cedar shake roof, holding its ridge of packed snow, like every other roof in the valley. Nothing to mark it, nothing to show what it was or what it had done. Your stores come through, he asked finally. Yes, she said. He nodded once, the way men do when they have been confirmed in a suspicion they are not quite sure how to characterize. He looked at the shed again, and then he pulled his cap off and turned it in his hands, and Sigrid recognized the gesture from the autumn, from the day at her lane when he had almost said something and left it. I was not a man who apologized easily or who explained himself more than the situation required, but there was something in the gesture, the cap in the hands, the eyes on the shed, that was the closest he would come to either. That hole under the shed, he said. Yes, a pause. Your father showed you how to do that. And there it was, the thing he had almost said in the autumn, finally spoken. I had known all along, from the first day he saw the mound of subsoil and the creek stone. The old man had recognized the shape of what she was building, had seen it before, in the old country or in his own family's memory, and had held his peace, and had wondered all winter whether the young widow had understood the thing well enough to make it hold, and now he knew that she had. Sigrid thought about the lamplight in the Telemark root cellar, the rows of wax-sealed crocks, the smell of limestone and packed earth, the palm pressed flat against the wall. Her father, crouching beside her, reading the temperature of the ground with his hand, an ocean and a whole lifetime ago. He showed me the idea, she said. I had to figure out the rest, and that was the truth of it, the exact truth, neither claiming too much nor too little. The idea had come from her father, from Telemark, from the long chain of knowledge, passed hand to hand in certain parts of Scandinavia for generations before anyone thought to write it down. But the doing of it, the digging and the stone, and the fire-heated floor, and the depth judged right, and the place chosen by a palm pressed against the earth, the surviving of the worst cold in a generation, alone, on 80 acres, with a fresh grave on the north slope that had been hers. The idea was inherited. The result was earned. Torvald Engebretsen replaced his cap. He said he would see her at the general store, and he turned his horse toward the road, but he came back 3 weeks later, with his oldest son, and a list of questions that took most of an afternoon to work through, and they built their own version that spring under the south end of their equipment shed, following Sigrid's dimensions as closely as the different site allowed. It held through the following winter without trouble. The pit beneath Sigrid Alborg's firewood shed remained in use for 11 more winters. She improved it twice, once to extend the stone floor by 2 feet on the east end, adding the thermal mass she had felt was lacking on the very coldest nights of that first great test, and once to add a ventilation pipe, a short section of salvaged stovepipe, sealed with a damper that allowed controlled air exchange without significant heat loss. After a summer, when moisture had condensed against the canvas roof and worked into the hay layer, compressing it and reducing its effectiveness, she replaced the hay with packed dry moss from the north woods the following autumn, and found it performed even better, tighter, and less prone to settling. By the late 1930s, what sat beneath that woodshed was essentially identical, in principle, in materials, in the layered thinking behind it, to what her father had shown her in Norway, which had itself been built by his father, which was in turn a practical adaptation of something that had been common knowledge in certain parts of Scandinavia for generations, before anyone thought to write it down. No patent, no diagram, no newspaper article, just the knowledge, passed from hands to hands, from a root cellar in Telemark to a firewood shed in Minnesota, through a woman who had stood on a cold hillside with a mattock and a very clear memory of a palm pressed against a stone wall. Sigrid sold the property in 1948 and moved to Duluth to live near a niece, the daughter of a sister who had come over from Norway in the years between. The couple who bought the farm were young people from Wisconsin, optimistic and unprepared in equal measure. They discovered the pit on their second winter there, lifting the hatch by accident while reorganizing the firewood. They found it fully intact, the stone floor, the walls, the canvas and moss ceiling, the 8 steps cut into the earth. They wrote to Sigrid, asking what it was and what it was for. She wrote back a short letter, 3 paragraphs. The last one read, "The earth remembers summer longer than we do. It takes months to cool. Once you understand that, winter stops being the enemy. You are not fighting the cold. You are borrowing what the ground already has." They used the pit every winter for 30 years, until the property changed hands again. The couple's daughter, who had grown up helping load it each September and pull from it each January, the way Sigrid had once helped her own father in Telemark, described it once to a neighbor as the most reliable thing on the property. More reliable than the furnace, more reliable than the road, more reliable than the weather forecast. It never let us down, she said, not once. And somewhere in that sentence, spoken by a Wisconsin farm girl who had never met the Norwegian widow who dug the pit, who knew nothing of Halvard's grave on the north slope, or the visit from Mrs. Quayle, or the 9 days at 38 below, or the broken man who came up the lane in shame and went home with food and knowledge both. The whole long chain held. The lesson her father pressed into her hand, at 9 years old in a Telemark cellar, had crossed an ocean, survived a death, defeated a killing winter, and passed on, hand to hand, into a future neither of them would see. The earth remembers summer longer than we do, and so, it turns out, do the people who learn to listen to it. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to subscribe and share it. There are more like this, quiet stories of ordinary people and forgotten wisdom, and they deserve to be remembered.